Okay.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you again for being with us, and particularly to our two guests, to Dejevksy, who is a very distinguished commentator, a number of journals over the years, and particularly interested in expert on Russia and Eastern Europe, and John Stevens, Chair of the Federal Trust and a former member of the European Parliament. The title is Soft and Hard Power in the EU in 2033. That's a topic which has perhaps a bit more resonance than it might have done a couple of years ago, because the question of hard power and its relationship to soft power is one that, since the Ukraine war, people in the European Union think and talk about a great deal more than they used to. We referred to it in the first session, citing the Franco-German proposals or academic proposals, which do advocate the extension of majority voting to foreign policy, although they want to limit the role of the European Parliament in foreign policy. A quite interesting distinction. Mary, do you think the European Union will be able to make a better fist of exercising hard power in 2033? Does it make perhaps a better fist than people think already in exercising hard power? What would you say? Thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. Can everybody hear all right?
Yes.
I think the Ukraine war has been absolutely has changed the context and has changed the attitudes within the European Union completely. And I think that from being primarily a soft power organization, it's become a hard power organization almost by proxy. And we've had all the discussions over the years about whether there should be a European army, whether there should be a strengthened European pillar of NATO, and always there's been this question of how far the European Union's security dimension meshes or doesn't with NATO. And what we've seen with Ukraine is, in a sense, how the European Union has been functioning as, as I said, as a proxy for NATO, partly because NATO didn't want to be seen as waging a war on Russia. And so the assistance to Ukraine, whether it's military or financial, has been done mostly in the name of the European Union or bilaterally by European Union members. It's not been done by NATO. And this is one reason why I was so surprised about 3 weeks ago when the NATO Secretary General suddenly fetched up in Kiev, because that seemed to me to contradict everything that had happened over the previous year and a bit.
Yes. What do you think the future will be? We were talking about proposals, and we were suggesting that there might be some countries that were unwilling to draw the conclusions or possible conclusions that you've sketched. How do you think it's going to shake down over the coming years?
I think it's going to depend only partly on the European Union. I think it's going to depend an awful lot on the transatlantic context. Because we saw the effect of the Trump presidency last time around. If there's going to be a new Trump presidency, then I think Europe is going to feel that it's going to have to start relying more on its own resources for security. And by referring to a Trump presidency, I don't want to refer just to the prospect of Trump as president, but whether what we've been looking at is actually a very long-term shift in US policy, much more on the one hand towards a sort of isolation America first, domestically, but also a focus much more on Asia and China, which will leave the Europeans de facto having to look more after their own security. And the other aspect that it will depend on, of course, is Russia, but maybe I'll speak about that differently.
No, go, just tell us.
10 years is a very, very long time to look ahead. And one of the things I thought about actually sort of saying at the beginning was that if you look back 10 years ago to where we were, where the European Union was, where my particular interest, Ukraine, was 10 years ago. This time 10 years ago, we were looking at the absolute height of the attempts to attract Ukraine into the European Union. We were looking at the standoff between Russia and the EU and the US over Ukraine 10 years ago about an association agreement. In between then and now, what's happened? First of all, Ukraine turned it down because of what it saw was its then leader Yanukovych saw as a better offer from Moscow. We've seen his government removed in the name of a European orientation for Ukraine. We've seen a skirmish type war in eastern Ukraine. We've seen Russia's annexation of Crimea, and we're now looking at what is called a full-scale war between Russia and Ukraine. That's in 10 years. That's looking back 10 years. So if you look forward 10 years and focus on Russia, I think as it looks from today's perspective, you're looking at a completely divided Europe, Ed Lucas's New Cold War, with effectively Berlin and the East and the wall moved to the east. Maybe depending what happens in Ukraine, you're looking at something like Kharkiv becoming the new Berlin. But maybe we're not. Maybe we're going to start looking at a different sort of Russia, and that isn't necessarily predicated on a post-Putin Russia. It could depend also on attitudes in Europe. That if the US is preoccupied elsewhere, then Europe and the European Union will have to look, in my view, much more realistically at the fact that the continent is shared with Russia, and that what Russia has been going on about for 40 years about a post-Cold War security arrangement for Europe, that both Europe and Russia might have to start thinking much more along those lines. And in my view, if that is what we've started talking about, and that's what Russia wanted to start talking about in the 3-4 months before February 24th and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, then maybe we're looking at what in effect should have happened in 1993, but didn't, which was new security arrangements for Europe.
One final point, the argument that America is reorientating its interests would have been, I think, rather more plausible before February 2022, when Biden, in a way that pleased a lot of people and surprised some, really reasserted his traditional view of America's engagement in Europe. Why would even another Trump government not follow that same approach?
I think that you're rather assuming that Biden's position is going to stay the same for the next few months in the run-up to the over the next year before the American election, and I'm not sure that that can be assumed, because I think when you look at the trajectory of American opinion, both public opinion and political opinion, then you're looking at a cooling of support for Ukraine, an increased questioning of why the US is actually involved in this war, and what's happening now in the Middle East is only going to accelerate that process. So I think it's not particularly safe to assume that Biden's position today or yesterday is going to be the same as it is tomorrow or in the next year. There have been various attempts by Biden and by the Democrats to what they call lock in the current support for Ukraine, but I'm not sure that's actually either working or going to work. But what Trump has said on Ukraine, and it's very easy for us here to talk about Trump as though he's sort of a complete maverick and all by himself. But he has this knack of expressing what a lot of other people think to themselves. And one of the things that Trump has said is that if he'd been in charge, there would have been no war. There would have been no war in Ukraine, and that if he were president, it would stop within 36 hours or something. Now, both of those statements are Trumpist sort of hyperbole, but I don't think it's completely wrong to think that if Trump had been president, there would have been no war, because I think he would have picked up the proposals that the Russians put forward in December before the Russian invasion, and that at least there would have been some talking going on. I also think that Trump has this, he flouted a lot of the diplomatic rules, and it was interesting to me, for instance, that Biden flew for a few hours to Israel, which to me seemed to be the sort of thing that Trump would have done, but also the sort of thing that Trump would have done with Russia if anybody had seen a war, an actual war threatening. And the idea that Trump or somebody of his persuasion might actually be able to stop the war in Ukraine, not within 36 hours. But if you want to be really ruthless about it, you would say, well, you can stop the war in Ukraine, and you can stop it by ceasing all military and financial assistance to Ukraine, much of which comes from the United States. Now, on an ideological and moral perspective, you would say, well, that risks handing the victory to Russia. But maybe it doesn't. Maybe it's actually the prelude to talks, which, depending on the state on the military state or the attitudes of Russia and the European Union and the US and the Ukrainians at the time, could produce an end of the war that we're not seeing at the moment.
Thanks very much. Mary's covered a lot of ground there, John. Would you take up some of the points, or would you have some of your own?
Well, thank you. We're talking about the transition from soft power to hard power, and that's obviously the most dramatic consequence of the Ukraine war. And linked to that have been the concepts, of course, of engagement versus confrontation. And the reason why the Russian invasion of Ukraine was such a shock to the European Union is because it undermined really its fundamental principle that the way you achieve peace is by economic engagement. And there was a tremendous attempt of economic engagement with Russia, and it completely failed to preserve peace. And behind that, of course, looms the even more significant debate about how to deal with China. Again, the issue of engagement rather than confrontation, and whether we're heading towards a new Cold War which divides the world or not. And in the center of this, as Mary said, is the fraught relationship between the EU's role in defense, which is now clearly coming to the fore, and NATO. To unravel all of these, I think the first thing is to say that I'm absolutely convinced that the Europeans are now committed to Ukraine in a way that far exceeds any commitment that the Americans were. And I think it's quite significant, for example, in opinion polling over the war in Ukraine and the new crisis in Israel, that public opinion in Europe overwhelmingly prioritizes Ukraine over Israel. Public opinion in America is the reverse. And so whether we get Trump again or not, it is quite clear that America is not going to be playing the dominant role that it has been playing in European defense going forward. How complete that decline is remains to be seen. But European autonomy in defense is a coming fact. Now the question is how that expresses itself, and how it expresses itself in terms of the relationship between the EU structures and NATO, and this idea of a European pillar within NATO. The nervousness of the Europeans in coming out from under the umbrella of the United States. And of course, that umbrella is principally a nuclear umbrella. And that is the heart of this problem. If Ukraine, we have a thought experiment, had retained its nuclear weapons and had not succumbed to the guarantee given by the United States and British government when they gave up their nuclear weapons, if Ukraine was still a nuclear state, one wonders whether Putin would have been made. It's a fair question to put. And what has clearly been revealed in this whole situation is the fact that Europe is not sufficiently autonomous in nuclear weapons. And one can take this further in a Brexit connection, being slightly conspiratorial, those who favour us, I tend to, a significant Russian role in Brexit. Part of the strategic consideration of that was to separate the two European nuclear deterrent powers, Britain and France, so that it was impossible to have any coordination between the two. And this takes us down very murky waters, but there is a lot of plausibility in that analysis. But the underlying truth of this is that there is a realization that is not publicly expressed across Europe, and particularly in the major powers in Europe, in the European Union, that an increase in nuclear defense is essential. And I think that it's worth pointing out that under the terms of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, all those who signed it, starting with Germany, made one exception to their participation in the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was that were there to be a European nuclear deterrent, that would be acceptable. So I think there will be a de facto Europeanization of nuclear weapon capacity and an increase in that capacity in the coming years. And how that plays within the NATO structure, of course, under the NATO rules, the position of the British and French nuclear deterrent is somewhat anomalous. It is not fully part of the command structure in the way that the conventional forces are fully integrated in command. So this is a further element of how might a transformation of the European presence in NATO, the European membership in NATO, evolve. And this is obviously a matter that will be principally for the French, will be leading it, how they relate to the Germans, but other very significant players in this discussion are undoubtedly the Spanish, the Poles, and the Italians. So that I think is an important background development. Going forward from that is the question of, well, what is Edward Lucas, your colleagues, right that we're going to have a new Cold War, and that it's just that the border's been shifted, and but the same players are there, even if without the same ideological color, the Chinese and the Russians on one side, and Europe and America on the other. I think that is a mistake. I don't think it's going to emerge like that, because I think that it's the way in which the weight of the United States in particular, but Europe, West generally, economically in the world has shifted from the time of the Cold War, and the absence of the same ideological challenge that you had here, at least. You had a capitalism vision for the way the world should be that wanted to embrace the whole world. That America was leading a move to make everyone essentially as free as the Americans in their vision. And the Russians had the view that they were going to make everyone as communist as they were. These were but two rival universalist visions. But I don't think that that is the way we're going. I mean, people are now beginning to talk about a sort of new Westphalian order, in which no one really believes now that we're going to change China fundamentally. We have to coexist, and you're going to have a situation in which you have several poles. China will be one, certainly India, maybe another. Who knows what may emerge in Africa at time. The point is that we're moving away from ambitions to impose one order, one global economic order, way of doing things, democracy and the rest, on the world, or some alternative. I don't believe that the Chinese necessarily have a vision of making the whole world like the Chinese Communist Party in the way it's emerged. So in that sense, and you see this in the debate that the European Union has in how to deal with China, it is, it's not seeking a full-blown confrontation. It's aware of the security dimensions, becoming increasingly aware of the security dimensions, which are serious, particularly in terms of industrial intelligence and technological transfers and all the rest. But it is seeking a coexistence in the way that the Cold War fundamentally was not. And I think that's a very important proviso. And this is, I think, far better understood in Europe for obvious reasons than it is understood in the United States. And I think that difference between a European acceptance of a multipolar world in contrast to a much more reluctant acceptance of that by the United States is going to be an important theme going forward. But just to bring this down to some more immediate situation of what happens in Ukraine, I think it is tremendously important that Ukraine triumphs in this war. That may not necessarily mean it triumphs on all its borders, but I think that there is a growing, my impression is that there is a growing consensus in Brussels and elsewhere that for peace to be secured, it requires Putin to go, and it requires Russia to lose Crimea, because Crimea is the symbol, has been since Catherine the Great, has been the symbol of imperial Russia and Russia's imperial ambitions. And that the rendering the Crimea untenable by Russia, which seems to be the central theme for Ukrainian strategy at the moment, I think will succeed in time. And I think that that will make it difficult for Putin to survive. And I think the crucial element of this is China. The one also, I think, an analysis that is emerging in European studies is that the Ukrainian war is, in some respects, a Chinese operation to which Russia has become a puppet. And this is linked to the notion that China has clearly a sense of being excessively contained on its sea lanes. 90% of its trade is maritime, and that is through the island chain from Japan, Taiwan, Philippines, Singapore, controlled by the US Navy. And so the Belt and Road Initiative has been a continental alternative, of which bringing Russia into the Chinese camp, rather than as it was heading before, into a European camp, has been a very important part of this procedure. And the supreme irony of this from a Russian point of view is that Putin, the Russian patriot, has actually committed arguably the gravest crime any Russian patriot could possibly do, which is to restore the Tatar yoke. And the relevance of this in European engagement with China, perhaps this is an example of soft power finishing, is that the Chinese economy is in a weak position at the moment. They have problems. The EU is China's largest trading partner. We have some leverage at the moment. And this is why I'm quite optimistic. I think it is possible to put pressure on the Chinese to undermine the Russian war effort and to arrange perhaps a peaceable transition away from Putin. Russia is not the power it appears to be. It is powerful because it has China behind it, economically, principally. And so that, and the success in Ukraine would transform Europe's sense of itself. There's no doubt about that. It would anchor Europe as a hard power, not just a soft power. It would express also the ideal of what being European is all about. And that's its significance. So,
well, thank you for two very good presentations. Since you want,
Yes, I will.
can you work it into the answers to the
I'll do my
questions,
best.
and then we'll
I'll
give
do
you
my
an
best.
opportunity. Can people put up their hand? Richard, I saw you first.
Richard Seaborn, I think only qualification is as a Quaker activist. I think populism is something that has been not spoken of so far. And actually, of course, the Polish election takes the sting out of this. But if Europe had gone populist in the sort of way that America has, we would be facing a very different picture and a lot of uncertainties.
Can you pass the microphone to the gentleman in front of you?
Tonic Patch, solicitor, also Mansfield College, Oxford. I would like to ask a question really to Mary about some of her thoughts concerning Russia. Personally, as regards the Budapest Memorandum, I don't think there was ever any possibility of Ukraine retaining nuclear weapons because the United States would not accept Russian nuclear weapons being retained by any other country. And the United Kingdom and the United States were never going to go to war against a nuclear power for the sake of the territory of Ukraine. More substantively, I don't see how Russia can lose the war in Ukraine. Firstly, militarily, Ukraine is virtually entirely dependent on material support from the United States. Trump said he would stop the war in 15 minutes. Now, whatever he said, but it's not only Trump. I mean, the scientists have said the same thing. Many of the other Republican candidates have said the same thing. There's at least a 50% chance that a Republican who opposes the war in Ukraine will win. In any case, there is not a majority in the House at the moment. There's not even a speaker there who supports further support for Ukraine. And the United States is clearly pivoting away from the Ukraine war towards Asia Pacific and Israel. Europe does not have the military defense in order to go and supply Ukraine with enough hard power to defeat Russia. Nor do I believe is there any sufficient political unity within the European Union member states to either overthrow President Putin. I don't see that in most of Eastern Europe. I don't see that particularly in Germany. I certainly don't see that in France. Crimea is seen as an existential issue for almost all Russians, regardless of the future of Putin and how they think about Putin. And as for the idea of there being a European nuclear deterrent, I doubt very much that any French government would ever accede to that, because that would put in question their seat on the United States Security Council, which is a fundamental French political objective.
On United Nations.
United Nations Security Council, apologies.
Yeah. Okay. Can you pass it on to John and then we'll take a pause since people will put their hand up. John, and then you pass it along.
It's John Palmer, member of the Council of Federal Trust, spent many years in Brussels observing developments. I just wanted to make a couple of brief points. The first is we shouldn't underestimate the dynamic that is behind the next stage of European integration and European development. It is meeting with broad support across, with one or two relatively limited exceptions, the goals of, for example, a health union at some point, more of a social union, and certainly the development of a political, a European Union political community, they call it, it is a new and active instrument that will go far beyond even the quite ambitious next phase of European Union enlargement. There will be some Balkan countries that don't quite make the grade if we're looking 5, 6, 7 years down the track, or might not, rather than won't. And there are certainly interested parties in the Caucasus that would like to be eventually brought into the enlargement process. That, I think, will find its expression for quite some time in terms of this new concept of a European political community, which will have to have delegated and significant powers of decision if and when it comes to fruition. That's the first point. The second point I want to make is being made in to some extent already, which is that a Trump president, I talking to people in NATO about Trump, it's quite interesting. I talked to one recently retired official that I knew well during my years in Brussels. And he said that, look, be clear, Trump has said NATO is a Ponzi scheme for siphoning off American wealth to the advantage of of America's competitors. And he said that there was a general recognition that there would be substantive changes in the nature of the transatlantic relationship were Trump or a Trumpite president, excuse my voice, to emerge at the next presidential election. And that, I think, will accelerate further and put more urgency into this development of giving some teeth to the European political community. By the way, consistent with this interesting new philosophy that you can buy into as an outside member state, outside country, you can buy into different aspects of the proposed process of European integration without necessarily subscribing to full membership. I think this will not go unnoticed in Whitehall, and it comes on top of the evident fact that Britain, certainly under the next probable Labour government, will be opening talks on improving trade relations, etc. Once you do that, you open up a whole range of political options that have been closed for whatever it is, 8 years now. So what I'm saying is that there is quite a lot of thinking going on about the empowerment of the political union to take real strategic decisions, and not just to be a talking shop. And I think that that in turn will have a magnetic effect on British opinion here, because it will be very difficult for strategic policy to be made wholly in isolation from that development.
Thank you. We need Adrian.
Yeah, Sandy. I'm just going to ask a question, by the way. Very interesting about this issue about coexistence between the EU and Russia on the European continent. But the other thing, this session is about soft power. And one of the things that has struck me is how well Russia seems to be doing in some ways. And you see people waving Russian flags in West Africa and so on, and they're seen as sort of badges to wave. And is that a surprise? And what should we be learning from that? Putin being guest of honor at the Belt and Road meeting in Shanghai and so on. You know, Russia appears to be actually doing better than one would have expected in their sort of worldwide sense of being a player and people still respecting them.
I'll ask John to speak first. People comment particularly on Mr. Trump's view of Ponzi schemes. He's rather an expert in that field. We have to take seriously his assessment of NATO.
Well, I think the greater European defense is coming. The question is how difficult the process of getting there is going to be. And obviously, if we were to get Trump presidency, that would be a much more dramatic break than what is likely. What in my view is more likely is that you have a gradual retreat of the United States from responsibility for European defense and a gradual increase in European autonomy in defense. But the critical factor in this is China. And China has a vision that is a new Westphalian order in which there are a number of powers that are autonomous among themselves that coexist, and that there is no attempt anymore to impose models for the whole world, whether they be cultural, or philosophical, or moral, or whatever. And that, in the same way that at the end of the 30 Years' War, you got the end really of the idea of Christendom, and you had the emergence of nation state. And this is the same process, but on a global scale. And Russia has had this idea for a while, I suppose, since the end of the Cold War, but it has really become the instrument of China. And so when we see the encouragement across Africa of anti-Western feeling and anti-Western domination, and this is all part of a process which I think is irreversible, away from the idea that the whole world should be like the West, or should be like the United States, or whatever. But I think that in addressing the gentleman who was confident on Russian victory and Russian power, Russia's power is Chinese in all essential economic respects. They can only sell their oil, they can only generate their revenue, they can only find chips for their guided weapons, or for all the technological elements of their military machine without Chinese assistance. That is impossible. So you were right to say that Ukraine is heavily dependent on American weapons at the moment, but I do not think that if it came to it, that Europe was forced to replace the United States completely in supporting Ukraine, I don't think that support would be found wanting, actually. If it came, and I don't think it will come to that, but I think that the idea that the Europeans are incapable of sustaining an effort at a technological level or at a financial level against Russia at the moment. The issue is whether the Europeans should be engaging with China to end this, because that is the reality of this conflict. And I believe that the Chinese see in Europe part of their strategy for a multipolar world. I mean, what the Chinese do not want is for the Europeans to be entirely part of a new American or a renewed American global project. And in particular, they are not keen on seeing excessive European support for their ambitions in the Pacific. And this raises the issue. We can discuss what is Europe's attitude towards defending Ukraine. We can discuss what is Europe's attitude towards the state of Israel. We could argue, but the crucial question here is what is Europe's attitude towards Taiwan? And the notion, is that going to be absolutely the same as the American attitude towards Taiwan or not? And I think most people in Europe would say that Taiwan is not a critical interest in Europe in the way that it is perceived to be by the United States. So
Europe does not produce enough semiconductors to produce the weapons that Ukraine would need to defeat Russia.
But not as China. Not as China. I mean, the semiconductors are in Taiwan.
Yes.
And but the semiconductor capacity is being massively built up both in the United States and in Europe as we speak. What you can be absolutely sure is there are no semiconductors in Russia, except those they take out of washing machines they buy from us via Azerbaijan.
Mary.
Yeah, right. I actually disagree fundamentally with John on the nature of the relationship between Russia and China and the extent of Russia's dependence, and on the what that portends for the future. But I mean, we could be here all day discussing that. I would just sort of say that I don't see it like that. I would thank for the questions which actually and the points which actually give me an opening to how I wanted to respond to John in the first place. The idea that Ukraine would actually or could have been a nuclear power if things had been decided differently, I think that is a complete red herring. I hear this so often. What happened was when the Soviet Union broke up, was that the control for the actual control of the nuclear weapons rested in Moscow. There was no prospect of Ukraine being able to control those weapons that it had on its territory. They were like empty shells. Russia was then designated the successor state under international law, under the UN. And that made it the successor state also to the nuclear arsenal. But the idea that if it hadn't been, or that there could have been two successor states on, it wasn't just because of American opposition. It was because of the actual practicality. There was no possibility that Ukraine would have control over firing those nuclear weapons on its territory, because it didn't have that. On Crimea, I mean, I tend to agree that Crimea will become in time untenable for Russia. I think that's what's going on at the moment, that Russia is moving its fleet away from Crimea, what in 2014 was considered an absolute crucial facility in terms of the naval base at Sevastopol. This is becoming less and less feasible for Russia, and it's gradually moving its ships to Novorossiysk and various other places. We've seen essentially that the bottom is falling out of the tourist industry, Russian tourist industry in Crimea, because for the second summer in running, Russian tourists who tried to go back to Crimea have found themselves either stranded there or aware of attacks on Crimea, which makes them feel insecure. I agree that Crimea is going to be lost to Russia, but I'm not sure that that's going to happen in the framework of the war as it currently is. That it's more of a long-term thing, and that for Russia the symbolic possession of Crimea, even if it's just an empty shell, for the time being, that's going to be how it is. I think that, I mean, I'm very wary of over-optimism about either the Western prospects of backing Ukraine to victory, partial or complete, over Russia. I think it's quite dangerous to be overconfident about that. I'm not convinced that Europe, whether it's the EU or whether it's the European pillar of NATO, if the Americans were to reduce their support for Ukraine, whether they would actually have the capability to win the war, as it were, for Ukraine. I think that the losses Ukraine is sustaining at the moment are absolutely catastrophic, and that we may be looking at an earlier end to the war than maybe looks at the moment. But that's my personal view. There was a question about, also on Ukraine. I think that if we're looking ahead 10 years, then we're looking ahead exactly that timescale when it's been suggested that Ukraine will become a full member of the EU. Ukraine would like to become a member much sooner than that. It wants to be fast-tracked. I think that is quite a distant prospect, and I think there's going to be many more problems with Ukraine's accession than either the EU is admitting in public at the moment or that Ukraine envisages. We've already seen these foreshadowed with the argument about grain, much cheaper grain coming into Poland and Hungary, and the protests in Poland. Now, in part, that was an election ploy in Poland, but in part it wasn't. It's going to come back. If there's a serious prospect of Ukraine's accession to the EU, then the question of agriculture is going to be a big issue. And there are various things that need to be taken into account. Ukraine is a low-income country. It is a poor country. It's now an even poorer country than it was before the war. It's a big country. It's not, we're not talking about sort of Slovakia or Baltic states here. We're talking about a country which is territorially huge and which, at least before the war, had 40 million people. It may now be down to something like sub 30 million, but in EU terms, it's still a big country, and its accession will make a difference in a way that the accession of much smaller countries wouldn't do. And I think it's going to become a point of much greater contention than it looks at the moment. Question of populism. I think, yes, I mean, the Polish election has been very interesting on the populism front, because we saw the election in Slovakia where the trend looked the other way. And it's also quite important to make the same point about the size of the country. I mean, Slovakia is very small. So the political trend in Poland is maybe more significant than the opposite trend in Slovakia. But I think there's probably a need for a bit of caution even on Poland, because Tusk and his civic coalition, they didn't win and they didn't get the most number of votes. The most number of votes was gained by Law and Justice, and they're being given the first chance to form a government. Now they probably won't be able to do it. There'll probably be a government headed by Donald Tusk, which will be a pro-EU government, which will symbolically mean that the populist trend in Poland has been reversed. But his government, if it is a Tusk government, then it'll be constrained by the fact that it's a coalition, and it'll be constrained by things that are particular to Poland, which include the power of the farming lobby. It includes the attitudes to migration, and the idea that a Tusk government will suddenly sort of drop ideas of Polish nationalism and Polish national interests, because Donald Tusk is in charge. I think that would be an over-optimistic interpretation.
Although Tusk does have a certain record in the past, doesn't he? And it's fair to take that into account.
No, absolutely, and he understands how the European Union works. And I mean, if to make a counter argument too, it's what's particularly interesting about the Polish election was that it was the younger cohorts who turned out in greater numbers than the older cohorts and gave Tusk the numbers that he had, which may make it possible for him to form a government. And if you take that into consideration, then what you're looking at is something very interesting, because until now, I've seen quite a breach between the old Europeans and the new Europeans about really the reason for joining the EU and the reason for the European Union's existence. And if you look at the old Europeans, then it was a peace project and an economic project. And if you looked at the new Europeans, it was about protection. It was about protection for their own national sovereignty. It was about not sacrificing even a little bit of sovereignty to the EU. It was about security, and it was about economic prosperity. There was a very materialistic aspect to it, which is also very strong in the way that Ukraine saw the attraction of the EU, both in 2014 and now. And if what we're looking at in Poland with the votes of the younger generation is actually a slight shift, and a crossing of that bridge between Europe as a peace project and a grouping where you sacrifice small amounts of sovereignty for the greater benefit, then maybe what I've seen as this really philosophical split between the old Europeans and the new Europeans. Maybe we're starting to see that bridged in Poland.
John, there are two unresolved questions. One, Russia's success in soft power, and the question of a European nuclear deterrent, where doubts were expressed about its possibilities. Can you address those two questions?
Well, this discussion of Ukraine surrendering nuclear weapons was really just an introduction to the point that the fundamental reality in the security issues raised by the Russian invasion of Ukraine are to do with nuclear weapons. This is the only reason why there is this war going on, in fact, is because Western European nuclear capacity is too small. There is a dependence on the United States, and the feeling is that the United States is not ready to risk a full-blown nuclear confrontation with Russia over Ukraine. And therefore, the Europeans have been sort of dragged along with this. We find ourselves in a situation where we're fighting a proxy war, in essence. And we're having a war at all, because clearly, if this had been a confrontation between two nuclear powers, this would not have come to a proxy war. And so what has been raised by the Ukraine war is the need for a greater European nuclear capability, and I think that is going to emerge. And that the objections that this will mean the French having to give up their seat on the Security Council, well, there will be an EU seat on the Security Council. That's where this is going to go. And equally, the economic benefits from this process actually could be very significant, in the same way that the key reason why the United States has such a lead over the European Union's economy has been its position in high tech, and that position in high tech has been very closely related to military expenditure. So I think that what is happening is a remilitarization of Europe for the first time, seriously, since an autonomous remilitarization of Europe is underway. And Mary is right that the Eastern European view of joining the European Union was dominated until the Ukraine war by economic considerations and a sense of economic self-interest, and didn't have the same emotional roots as was present more in Western Europe. But I think the Ukraine war is beginning to substitute that. And the notion that the EU is not part of a peace project is not the case now, and will be even less the case as this crisis continues and towards a resolution. The crucial question is what happens in Russia, and is Russia really going to be happy to being what it is now, in my view, to all intents and purposes, a Chinese puppet? Is the Tatar yoke back, and will it be greeted as such? And that, I think, is the long-term question. Are the Russians Europeans on the fundamental issue? It has some uncomfortable parallels with the Brexit debate here, because the other question, there are two European countries which do not accept the idea that they are Europeans, and they are both the victors of the Second World War, Britain and Russia. And there are unnerving parallels between the Brexit mentality and the Putin mentality. Obviously, they express themselves in much more benign form here than they do in Russia. But there are parallels, and that's the question. And I think that it may well be that I think it was actually one of the last interviews that Helmut Kohl gave was his conviction that China would make everyone.
Yeah. Did you want to say something about Russian?
Yes, I wanted to say something about Russian. I think one very interesting thing which is going on at the moment is what a partial view we get here of how the world's operating at the moment. I've felt from the very beginning of the Ukraine war that we've been seeing this from the European and the Western perspective. And however much you may condemn Russia, however ruthless and unreasonable you think Russia is being, Russia has a view, and it's one that we haven't been seeing. But it's one that quite a lot of the rest of the world has been seeing. And it's what we're now seeing the same thing replicated in the Middle East. And one of the, if you listen to Western broadcasting, or you read our papers, you get the idea that the diplomacy is basically being conducted by the United States, Biden's flying visit, all the Europeans successively arriving in Jerusalem. But this is only a partial view. One of the things that has gained almost no publicity in the last week is the fact that there have been 130 countries, a lot of them represented at head of state level, in Beijing for the 10th anniversary summit of the Belt and Road Initiative. Putin's been there. Xi Jinping has been running the show. There have been diplomatic initiatives originating from that summit in Beijing, from the bilateral and multilateral meetings going on there, that have been projected to the UN. That there's been a draft resolution was put forward by Russia and backed by others, but then rejected, for a ceasefire in the Middle East. And apparently they're going to have another go. We haven't heard any of that here, but there's a lot more countries involved in that, which includes, I gather, a bilateral attempt by Turkey and Russia to give some sort of protection or sponsorship to the aid convoys to try to get into Gaza. I think they've started moving this morning. But it's been a push from those countries, not just Western diplomacy that's going on. And one of the reasons why there's this great sort of current expression which is called convening power, which is something the UK is supposed to have an enormous amount of and compensate for Brexit in part. But Russia has this thing called convening power, because it has a lot of people that and that includes India, it includes China in a slightly different respect. It includes quite a lot of African countries, and it includes Middle East. And Russia can get those people together, and it can talk to those people in a way that is actually quite difficult. Slightly less difficult for the Europeans, but it's very difficult for the US and the UK after Iraq, Libya. The record in the particular region, which is suddenly leapt back into the news, is not one that gives us particular diplomatic clout. Russia has that. And Russia has also, the fact that they were waving Russian flags in Niger, there was an interpretation of that said, oh, this was all because of the Wagner group had been giving assistance, and Russia was sort of inciting people to come out and demonstrate in favor of Russia. There was no evidence whatever that this was anything to do with Russia. It was a symbolic use of the Russian flag as indicating something that wasn't the US, the UK, the Europeans, and it's very much in a sort of opposition to what so many countries see as a consensus that has reigned for so long and that they've objected to. And this has started to, it's interesting to me that this has started to take expression in waving the Russian flag as opposed to the Chinese flag.
Well, the Chinese, I think, are clever enough not to have their own flag waved. But the point is, because you say this is convening power, you're comparing it to Britain's role post-Brexit in trying to still play at the top table. I think that is a very fair parallel, because I do believe that Russian power is a shadow. What lies behind it is the Chinese agenda for a new Westphalian order, a multipolar world, which rejects the notion that the whole world should submit to one or other model. And the crucial point is that the Europeans are much closer to embracing that vision, actually accepting it as inevitable. That we're not going to westernise China or India or whatever, or Africa, and than the Americans. And that's one reason why I'm actually optimistic that there will be some deal possible on Ukraine, because I don't think that the Chinese wish to push the Europeans fully back into the American camp. Because there are parallels to this in debates about the role of the dollar compared to the euro in global markets and having a multipolar currency order in the future of the rest. And that's the crucial thing, that Europe has a role in accepting the reality that trying to impose one model for the way the world should be is over. We are in a new Westphalian order, and we have to make it work. We have to make it sure that it is peaceful. That's the crucial thing. And the Americans are not yet there. But I think will become, the more they're focused on the Pacific, the more the Europeans are autonomous in ensuring their security in Europe, the more that transition, that acceptance by the West that the old universalism is over. I think the easier that will be.
Good. Well, that finishes us very promptly at 11:30. If it is true that the next great leap forward, to use a Chinese expression, in European integration is going to be the sphere of defence, and of course that's the way it was supposed to be at the beginning in the 1950s. We were supposed to start off with defence and then work our way through to other things. So backwards into the future. That's what we got in front of us. One more round of applause for an excellent